All right, for you guys, for many of you who don't know who I am, my name's Frankie Carrillo. And first of all, I just want to thank Sean and Calvary Chapel for the invitation, for allowing me to speak at this year's Apologetics conference. I know we've been on different schedules in the past, and Sean's invited me, but I finally got a chance to come today. And just a little background about myself is apologetics has been a passion of mine ever since I gave my life to the Lord 8 years ago. Before I gave my life to the Lord, I had no clue what apologetics was. I thought it had something to do with saying I'm sorry and how do you apologize to people. I had no clue what apologetics was until I came to the Lord, and it really just captured me, it grasped me, One example that I had, even before I came to the Lord, I was taking a course. It was a writing course. And I had a professor that was coming over from San Diego State main campus. And I believe it was an argumentative or a compare and contrast. I think it was an argumentative paper that we were supposed to write. And she said, in the details, she said, I don't want any of you guys writing about God because you can't prove that His existence. And it kind of bothered me, even though I wasn't going to church at the time. I was thinking, well, she's right. How do I prove His existence? It was, I grew up in church, and it was through kids' stories, and that was my background of these miracles that were going on in the Bible. But I really had no way of actually proving or disproving or defending my faith. So when I gave my life to Christ, as I said, and apologetics is something that grasped me, I ended up changing my major, and I received my master's in biblical studies, and with an emphasis in apologetics and theology. So my whole life was turned around in that moment, where I went from studying criminal justice to, Lord, I want to know more about you. I want to know who you are. I want to be able to defend the faith. I want to be able to teach others how to defend their faith as well. I want to show people that there is a case that can be made for the existence of God. In any case, this morning I'd like to jump straight into the second session. And when we were planning today's event a few months ago, around that time, my wife and I were having a discussion. And she threw out the term, well, God's outside of time. And I started thinking, well, I don't know if that's philosophically true. I know as believers, we throw that around, God's outside of time. So then we started having our I don't want to say argument, but it was a debate, our own debate within our own home. And she would throw out her point, I throw out mine, and we were going back and forth. And I said, well, why don't you read, this text? Why don't you listen to this podcast? Why don't you watch this video? And as she started reading and becoming more familiar with the philosophical ideas of time, I started changing her mind as well. So I'm hoping to show you guys through philosophy and through science some of the ideas of time, God's eternality, the finitude of the universe, and how all this ties in theologically. So this is why I chose this topic this morning. And it is a subject that philosophers have been discussing for thousands of years. Ancient Greek philosophers believed that matter was necessary and uncreated, therefore eternal. And this view was in contrary to the ancient Jewish, who thought that God created, as mentioned in Genesis 1:1. And for several centuries, you had this idea and these ideas in the marketplace from the Greeks, from the Jews, from the Muslims, from Christians, from Protestants, from Catholics, all coming together. But during the 12th century, there was a Muslim theologian from Persia by the name of Al-Ghazali. And he was concerned about the influence that Greek philosophers were having on the Muslims at the time with their denial of God's creation of the universe. So he created his own argument in a critique of Greek philosophy entitled The Incoherence of Philosophers. So Al-Ghazali created his own argument. He created an argument that stated, "Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins, therefore it possesses a cause for its beginning." Today I'm going to be referencing Dr. William Lane Craig. For those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's a philosopher. He's a Christian philosopher who's written a substantial amount of books on time. He's written substantial amount of books on cosmology. He's also written on, and he's also debated many atheists. He's also written articles and journals. So he has a lot of knowledge, and he's someone who has inspired me in today's topic. So if we look at the first slide, basically, Dr. William Lane Craig summarizes Al-Ghazali's reasoning in 3 simple steps. Can you guys see that out there? So he summarizes Al-Ghazali's reasoning in 3 simple steps. Number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So I actually taught this when I was teaching the Apologetics course here at the Calvary Chapel Bible College. But as the years have gone on, I've been able to learn more and really grasp my mind around these philosophical arguments. When I look back, even just 2 or 3 years ago and to this point now, there's so much information. So I'm going to try my best to take these philosophical points and to break them down so that you guys can understand them and so that you guys can defend your faith with these arguments. So premise 1, and this is a deductive argument. Basically, if the first point and the second point are found to be false, then the conclusion is false. So all you have to do, all I have to do, or anyone has to do, is find the first or the second point to be false, and the whole argument is thrown out the window. So let's look at premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. And I want to give you guys 2 reasons to support this premise. Number 1, something cannot come from nothing. For something to come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit from a hat, or you have a magician, you at least have the magician and you have the hat. But what atheists say is that the universe just sprang into existence from nothing. It sounds like magic, doesn't it? Nothing isn't a lack of time and space, just a dark void where space exists. You literally have no thing, not even space itself. So if you deny premise 1, you got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. That nothing existed, that no thing existed, and then out of nowhere, the universe just sprang up. No one sincerely believes that things just pop into existence. How many of you guys have ever seen a car just pop and just land in your driveway out of nowhere, or fall from the sky, or a horse just start running just appear out of nowhere? Some of us wish that we could have money just appear out of nowhere, right? In our pockets. But what we see in reality is that things don't just spring from nothing, from nowhere. We see that almost everything that we look at, we can look at this microphone and say someone built this. We can look at this pulpit and say someone constructed this. It came from a tree, the wood, the tools. Everything came from something, right? So sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics, subatomic particles, so-called virtual particles, come into being from nothing. Or certain theories of the origin of the universe are sometimes described in popular magazines as getting something from nothing, so that the universe is the exception. But the skeptic response represents a deliberate abuse of science. The theories in question have to do with particles originating as a fluctuation of the energy contained in the vacuum. Could the vacuum be considered nothing? I think not. So when you hear scientists saying, oh, you have this subatomic particles reacting with this, and then something springs up, well, the vacuum that the subatomic particles that they're in is a thing. We can't consider the vacuum nothing. Rather, in physics, the vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. To say that such things come from nothing is a distortion of theories. So what do we know nothing to be? Nothing cannot be considered empty space. Nothing is the absence of anything whatsoever, even space itself. Nothingness has literally no properties at all, since there isn't anything to have any properties. It was Stephen Hawking that said, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Hawking assumes that the law of gravity exists and that gravity itself exists. Gravity and the law of gravity is not nothing. When physics talk about nothing, they often appear to mean a quantum vacuum. Dr. Craig mentions that a colleague of his from Western Michigan University by the name of Quinton Smith, who by the way is a skeptic, who said, the universe came from nothing, by nothing, for nothing. Let that sink in for a second. The universe came from nothing, from no thing, by no thing, and for nothing. That sounds like magic, doesn't it? This is the faith of an atheist. I think it takes greater leap of faith to believe this is true than to believe the existence of God. Actually, it's worse than magic, like I said. At least with the magician, you can explain that you have the hat, you have the magician, that's where the rabbit comes out, right? Where the flowers come from. But when you have no thing, then how can anything spring up from no thing whatsoever? If this is the alternative to the belief in God, then unbelievers can never accuse believers of irrationality. What could be more irrational than this? Let's look at number 2. If something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't just come into being from nothing. Why is it only that universes come into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? Why don't, like I said earlier, why don't cars just come out of nowhere? Why don't planets just spring out of nowhere? Why don't people just spring from nothing? Atheists usually say that this is true about everything in the universe, but not about the universe itself. Or they might say, all right, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? How many of you guys have ever heard that? If everything has a cause, then what caused God? Or they ask this as if they've asked some profound question. And all they've done is misunderstood the premise. Premise 1 does not say that everything has a cause. Rather, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something that is eternal wouldn't need a cause since it never came into being. So what do we know God to be? He is eternal and he is uncaused. This is what skeptics say is also special pleading for God, since this is exactly what the atheist has traditionally said about the universe. They said that the universe is eternal and uncaused. The problem is that we have good evidence that the universe is not eternal, but had a beginning. So the atheist is backed into the corner, having to say that the universe sprang into being without a cause, which is absurd. Let's look at premise 2. The universe began to exist. The more controversial premise in the argument is premise 2. Let's look at 2 philosophical arguments and 2 scientific arguments this morning of premise 2, that the universe began to exist. So let's look at 2 philosophical arguments. The first one, an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. See, Ghazali argued that an infinite number of things cannot exist. We need to be careful with the nuances here. He recognized that a potential or potentially infinite things or number of things could exist, but deny that an actual number of things could not exist. This is where potential versus actually infinity come into play. So we discussed potentially infinite, and it serves as a limit that is never reached. How many of you guys have your phones with you this morning? I want you guys to pull your phones out for a quick second. Not to read your text messages, not to look at your Instagram feed, Facebook. I want you to open your calculator up. Okay, so I want you to put 1 divided by 2 equals. And I want you to keep doing that. You get an answer, you divide it by 2 equals. Divided by 2 equals. Divided by 2 equals. Divided by 2 equals. So mathematicians and modern math has been able to create a potential infinite, right? We can put it into our calculators when we're discussing in infinity, right? We can put these numbers in and keep pressing divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 2. You can get any 2 points and divide that, and then divide that in infinitum. But that's not an actual infinite. This is a potential infinite. An actual infinite is something that could not exist. You couldn't, if you had let's say water bottles, and you had an infinite amount of water bottles, would we have enough space here for us to sit down? There would be an infinite amount of water bottles that would take up all space, that would take up all time and into infinity. So an actual infinity is something that does not exist. It's only something that we can talk about. It's only something that we can discuss mathematically. But when we discuss an actual infinite of things, it isn't a collection of things that is growing into infinity, but it's a number of members greater than any finite number. Modern math has objected Ghazali's argument to say that in modern set theory, the use of actual infinite sets is common. For example, the set of natural numbers 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth has an actually infinite number of members in it. They say it isn't potentially infinite, but actually infinite. But these developments in modern mathematics merely shows that you adopt certain axioms and rules when you have a discussion in a consistent way. It actually lets us talk about infinity. It gives us axioms and it gives us rules to have these discussions without contradicting yourself. Basically, it gives us the ability to discuss the actual infinite, but it doesn't absolutely show, but it does absolutely nothing to show that such mathematical entities really exist, or that an actual infinite number of things exist. The number of past events must be finite, which leads to the universe having a beginning. Let's look at number 2. You can't pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. See, the series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. The series of past events is like a sequence of dominoes falling one after another till the last domino today is reached. How many of you guys ever played with dominoes as kids? And you would set them up, and I know sometimes it's frustrating, you clip it and then they'd fall, but you have to set them right back up, right? So there's always that first initial domino that had to be knocked over to reach the last domino. So in a sequence of past events, it's formed by one domino or one day reaching the next day, and then the next day. So no series that is formed by adding one member after another can actually be infinite. You cannot pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. If we reach today, that means that there's a series of past events that must be finite and having a beginning. So let me try to give you an explanation or an illustration. If time was eternal in the past, we would never reach today, because there would never be that last domino set up. You'd have to set up another one, and then set up another one, and set up another domino, which means that we will never actually reach this moment that we've reached today. this moment of the Apologetics conference. So there's objections, though, that have been made about this argument. And an objection from every past point, we can reach the present. Basically, this is saying that every event in the past is only a finite distance from the present. So what skeptics have said is that you can if you have zero, if you have today, they say that you can choose any point in the past and start counting this way. So they're saying you can actually traverse time. You can pick 1,000,000 years and then walk this way and then finally get here and like, okay, 1106, I'm here. Or you can pick 2,000,000 years and come back this way. So they say that if you choose a number and count to zero, you have a finite distances from zero and from the past events. But there's an answer to this, and this is called the fallacy of composition. This fallacy confuses a property of a part, which is the 1,000,000 till now, or the 2,000,000 till now, that's the part, with the property of the whole. An example is an elephant. I might be able to pick up the trunk of an elephant. I might be able to pick up the foot of an elephant, but can I pick up the whole elephant? No, the parts of the elephant may be light, but the whole elephant isn't. Or in this case, just because every finite part of a series can be crossed or counted down doesn't mean the whole infinite series can be crossed or counted. So the question is not how any finite part of the past can be formed by adding one event after another, but how the whole beginningless past could be completed by adding one event after another. Let's look at scientific arguments. The explanation of the universe. One of the most astonishing developments of modern astronomy, which Ghazali would have never have anticipated, is that we now have strong scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. Until the 20th century, we had men having these discussions philosophically, but they had no clue about the science behind this. And we're fortunate enough as believers to have the science now to back up the philosophy and our theology. So let's look at the Big Bang. Throughout history, men have assumed that the universe as a whole was unchanging. Of course, things in the universe were moving about and changing, but the universe itself was just there, so to speak. This was also Einstein's assumption when he began to apply his new theory of gravity, called the general theory of relativity in 1917. With what Einstein found in his equations was that the universe was either blowing up like a balloon or else collapsing upon itself. His equations enabled the universe to walk on a tightrope between exploding and imploding. And during the 1920s, the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and Belgian astronomer George Lemaitre took Einstein's equation at face value, and as a result, they independently came up with an expanding universe. And then in 1929, American astronomer Edwin Hubble, through tireless observation at Mount Wilson Observatory, made a startling discovery that verified Friedmann and Lemaitre's theory. He found that the light from the distant galaxies appeared to be redder than expected. That means that everywhere he put his telescope, he would see this red light. So we call this red light red shift. And the light was most plausibly from the stretching of the light waves as the galaxies move away from us. The redshift is a key concept for astronomers when discussing the stretching of the light, because this is due to the velocity of recession, thus distance. So the best way to look at this is when you see a car leaving, you see the red lights, right? And when you see a car coming, you see the white lights. So what's happening in this expanding universe was that everywhere he fixed his telescope, these lights were red, meaning that the universe was expanding. And I'm going to tell you why this is important. It appeared that there was a cosmic explosion and that all other galaxies were flying away from us. What does this sound like? It sounds like creation, doesn't it? It sounds like at the moment when God created and everything began to expand and time and space began and started to expand, science is actually proving what the Bible says. The beginner of time. As you trace the expansion of the universe back in time, so you go backwards, everything gets closer and closer together. And eventually the distance between any 2 points in space becomes zero. You can't get any closer than that. And at that point, you've reached the boundary of space and time. But is this standard model correct? Is it correct in preceding a beginning of the universe? Well, physicists have proposed scores of alternative models over the decades since Friedman and Lemaitre's work. And those that do not have an absolute beginning have been repeatedly shown to be unworkable. Hawking's theory that does not have a beginning point but have a point-like beginning still has a finite past. So basically, Hawking tried to create a theory where this universe actually came to a point, but it was rounded. So he didn't want to come to a space-time singularity, because what does that show? That there was a point in where everything began from, right? But even the curve on his cone has a limit. There has to be something before that, and there has to be a point where that came into being. So in 2003, 3 leading scientists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove that any universe that has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be finite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. Their theorem implies that even if our universe is just a tiny part of a so-called multiverse. How many of you guys have ever heard of the multiverse? They say that we're just a small universe in a sea of universes. So, but even the multiverse has to adhere to Borde's, Guth, and Vilenkin's theory. Vilenkin said, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There's no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Let's look at the second scientific argument. This is one that many people have heard of or are familiar with. The thermodynamics of the universe. According to the second law, unless energy is being fed into a system, that system will become increasingly disorderly. Example, if you had a bottle that was closed, as a closed vacuum, and inside you injected some gas molecules, that gas would spread itself evenly throughout the bottle. The chances that the gases would huddle together in a corner of a bottle is practically zero. So this is because there's many more ways in which the molecules could exist in a disorderly state than in a orderly state. The end of the world. In the 19th century, scientists realized that the second law implies a grim prediction of the future of the universe. Given enough time, all the energy in the universe would spread itself out evenly throughout the universe, just as in the example of the bottle. So why is our universe running out of energy? If it's existed for eternity, if it's always existed, then why is it running out of energy? Think of a gasoline tank. How many of you guys wish that your gas tank would stay full forever, for an eternity, right? The way gas prices are going up right now. So think of the universe the same way, that there was a certain amount of energy in the universe when it came into being, but with time, we're starting to see that energy is slowly depleting. So the universe will become a featureless soup in which no life is possible. Once the universe reaches such a state, no significant further change is possible. It is a state of equilibrium in which the temperature and pressure are the same everywhere. If given enough time, the universe will inevitably stagnate in a state of heat death, meaning it couldn't have lasted forever. Well, of course, you're always going to have people try to come with new arguments, right? So we have the oscillating universe. So entropy, which is a quantitative measure of what the second law of thermodynamics describes, is the spreading of energy until it is evenly spread. This is entropy. So it accumulates from cycle to cycle, making each cycle longer and longer than the one before. So some scientists are saying, well, we're seeing the depletion in energy because it's just going through a cycle. Imagine throwing a ball and then it bounces, right? And each bounce would be a cycle in our universe. So they're saying, oh, we can explain that. It's basically an oscillating universe. We see the energy depleting because we're going down. And once it bounces, we're going to go back up, and then we're going to go down. So this is normal. What this means, if you trace the cycles back in time, they also get smaller and smaller until you come to the first cycle and the origin of the universe. We still have to explain where does that first cycle begin. So even if this is true that the universe is oscillating, you still need to get to the first bounce, which is something that they can't explain. But not only that, astronomers have estimated on the basis of current radiation levels in the universe that the universe cannot have gone through more than about 100 previous cycles. So the amount of radiation levels that we find in our universe doesn't show that there would be more than 100 bounces. So it's still showing a beginning. There's also other ones, the bubble universes. Other theories have proposed that our universe is just a bubble in a much larger multiverse of bubble universes. The claim is that the second law only applies to the bubbles, but not the whole multiverse. But what did Borde, Guth, and Vilenkin theorem say? That it applies to the multiverse and that it requires an absolute beginning. Baby universes. Some say, how many of you guys ever heard, well, maybe black holes are entrances or wormholes? You guys ever watch some of those science channels or history channels where they start talking about wormholes and they start talking about black holes and they're saying, well, maybe through this black hole a new universe comes into being. And then another black hole exists and then another universe will come into being. So they're saying that in space-time, there's energy that travels and spawns baby universes. And the way they describe it is you have these baby universes whose umbilical cords can be pinched shut, creating another universe. But the scenario contradicts subatomic physics, which requires that the information that goes down a black hole remains in our universe. So what happens is when this new universe comes into being, according to their theory, you're still getting what's the best way to put it? You're still getting the same information or cosmic DNA coming into the new universe. Nothing has changed in this new universe as far as cosmic information. So the same thing will apply to the universe that it came from. So, conclusion, on the basis of both philosophical and scientific evidence, we have good grounds for believing that the universe began to exist, since whatever begins to exist has a cause. It follows that the universe has a cause. But is the universe self-caused? Prominent atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett agrees that the universe has a cause, but he thinks that the cause of the universe is itself. He calls this the ultimate bootstrapping trick. He claims that the universe created itself. But where did the boots come from? Where did the so-called the universal boots and laces come from? There's no explanation for that. How could something even grab itself and put its boots on if there's no thing whatsoever? See, we've discussed how this is nonsense. And he isn't saying that the universe is self-caused in the sense that it has always existed. No, he's saying that the universe brought itself into being. But this is impossible, for in order to create itself, the universe would have to already exist. And it would have to exist before it existed, which is logically incoherent. But we know that we have a personal creator of the universe. See, the cause of the universe must therefore be a transcendent cause beyond the universe. It has to be bigger than the universe, and it has to transcend it as well. This is because this cause be itself uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible. Oh, well, who created God? Oh, well, who created that God? Well, who created that God? We'd go for eternity asking the same question. So you can't ask that question. You go into infinite series of causes, which is impossible. So it is therefore an uncaused first cause. It must transcend space and time, since it created space and time. It must be immaterial and non-physical, imaginatively powerful, since it created all matter and energy. And finally, it must be a personal being. And only a mind could fit the above description of a first cause. Thank you, guys.